Welcome back to the woods. Find a quiet place, maybe a cup of tea or something warm, and let's step together into a slower world, where the days pass gently and small creatures live simple, beautiful lives beneath the trees. The morning had lengthened into a gentle golden haze, and the light over Willowmere Brook had taken on that sleepy warmth that makes the air itself feel drowsy. Hobble, with his honey jar secured under one arm and his basket swinging from the other, ambled along the footpath homeward. The moss beneath his feet felt springy and cool, and now and then he stopped to nudge a fallen acorn into the grass, not out of need, but because tidiness comforted him. A wood pigeon cooed softly from a high beech branch. Somewhere nearby, the faint hum of bees thickened the air. Bran's hives would be heavy with nectar this time of year. Hobble smiled to himself, imagining the porridge he'd have for luncheon, sweetened with just the right amount of honey. He followed the brook where it curved beneath a low arch of stone, the old bridge, as everyone in the woods called it, though no one could quite recall who had built it. The bridge was covered in moss and tiny creeping thyme that scented the air when brushed, and it was a favorite resting spot for many of the woodland creatures. Today, Hobble found Letty the squirrel sitting there, tail curled neatly about her paws, sorting through a pile of acorns. "Morning, Letty," said Hobble. Busy as ever. Letty looked up, her bright eyes gleaming. "Oh, Hobble, yes, I'm trying to separate the good from the bad before I bury them. Some have been nibbled already. Dreadful manners, if you ask me. Could be the voles again," Hobble said sympathetically. "They've no sense of propriety when it comes to stores." Letty wrinkled her nose. "Yes, but one must make do. Will you stay for a nut or two?" "Thank you, but I've just come from Bran's. Got some of his finest honey here." Her ears perked. "Honey, you say?" "Indeed. Enough for a week's breakfasts, I should think." "Well then, at least sit a moment," Letty insisted, brushing away a few dry leaves from the bridge's edge. "You could tell me what news Bran had. He always knows more about the goings-on than anyone else." Hobble set down his basket and took a seat beside her. "Oh, nothing much out of the ordinary," he said. "The bees are well, and the marigold have come up strong. He's thinking of planting chamomile along the path. Says the scent keeps wasps away." "Clever, that," Letty said approvingly. "If only something kept jays from digging up my acorns. I caught one the other morning, right in the act." "No," Hobble said, amused. "What did you do?" "Gave him a piece of my mind, of course," though he just laughed and flew off with one in his beak. "Oh, the nerve." They shared a quiet chuckle. The brook gurgled gently beneath them, carrying fallen leaves downstream. Overhead, sunlight flickered through the branches, dappling their fur and the moss-covered stones in soft gold. After a while, Hobble rose. "Well, I'd best be off. Got to see about my porridge, you know." "Always thinking of your meals," Letty teased lightly. "It's important business," Hobble said with mock dignity, "and not to be neglected." He tipped his cap and set off once more, humming softly to himself. The path wound onward through a patch of ferns, tall enough that they brushed his shoulders, releasing the earthy scent of rain-soaked soil. He passed a cluster of mushrooms, pale and tidy, like little umbrellas left behind, and paused to admire them. The woods were thick with life today. Dragonflies glimmered above puddles left from last night's drizzle, and a pair of wrens darted past, chittering cheerfully. As Hobble neared his burrow, he noticed a rustling sound from behind a fallen log. He stopped, tilting his head. Out popped Moll the shrew, nose twitching, paws dusted with soil. "Oh, Hobble, just the creature I hoped to see," she said breathlessly. "Morning, Moll. What's the trouble?" "Well, I've been digging a new pantry tunnel," she said, gesturing behind her. "But I seem to have hit a root I can't get past. It's as stubborn as an old oak." Hobble chuckled. "Might be one at that. Wanting to take a look? If it's no bother." He followed her into the small tunnel entrance, which smelled pleasantly of fresh earth. The space was narrow but neat, lined with small pebbles she'd carefully placed to keep the walls from crumbling. Sure enough, a thick root curved across the path ahead, solid as stone. "You won't be getting past that easily," Hobble said, pressing it with his paw. "It's from one of the beaches above. I'd leave it and dig around if I were you." Maul sighed. "I thought as much. Still, you've saved me the trouble of trying to gnaw through it." "Well, I'll tell you what," Hobble said kindly. "I'll bring you a bit of bread later on. You've worked hard, I can tell." Her eyes brightened. "You're a dear, Hobble. Thank you." He left her there, still muttering about roots and soil, and made his way home. When at last he reached his burrow, he set the honey jar on his kitchen shelf, lit the stove again, and stirred his porridge. The smell of oats and steam filled the small room. He poured a spoonful of honey into the bowl and added a few slices of apple left from the previous day, the edges just beginning to soften, perfect for cooking. He sat by his round window as he ate, watching sunlight dance on the water below. After breakfast, Hobble decided to tidy up the shelves. He dusted jars, straightened his collection of pine cones, which he insisted were purely decorative, and polished the small brass acorn he kept on his mantelpiece, a gift from Letty last winter. Outside, the forest moved slowly toward afternoon. The light shifted, becoming warmer and deeper. A breeze wandered through the trees, stirring the leaves into whispers. Hobble opened his window and leaned out. The air tasted of moss and wood smoke. Someone, perhaps Bran, had lit a fire already. Feeling rather content, he decided to take a walk to the stone pool, a quiet bend in the brook where smooth pebbles gleamed like silver in the shallows. It was a place where the forest always seemed half asleep, wrapped in birdsong and the faint murmur of running water. He took with him a small loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese, simple provisions, and set out once more. The path to the stone pool wound between tall beeches, their trunks dappled with lichen the color of old parchment. Here and there, squirrels darted up the bark, tails flicking like sparks. When he reached the pool, Hobble sat on the largest stone, dipping his paws into the cool water. The brook here ran clear and steady, the bottom littered with smooth, round pebbles that glittered in the light. Tiny fish darted between them, and dragonflies hovered above the surface like bits of living glass. He unwrapped his lunch carefully, took a small bite, and chewed thoughtfully. Cheese, bread, the faint scent of thyme from the butter he'd spread. It was all perfectly ordinary, yet quietly marvelous. As he ate, he noticed movement across the water. Finch the frog, seated on a low rock, humming to himself. "Afternoon, Finch," Hobble called. Finch looked up, blinking lazily. "Oh, good day, Hobble. Lovely weather we've got. Just sitting here, watching the minnows." "Peaceful spot for it," Hobble agreed. Finch stretched one leg and smiled in that slow, content way frogs often do. "You wouldn't happen to have any crumbs to spare, would you? Been sitting too long to think of hopping home for lunch." "Of course." Hobble tore off a bit of bread and tossed it gently across the water. Finch caught it deftly. "Much obliged," said the frog. "You always think ahead, Hobble. Bread, honey, cheese. Your burrow must be the coziest place in the woods." Hobble chuckled modestly. "It's snug enough, though I could do with a new rug before winter." "You'll have to ask Letty," Finch said, eyes half closed. "She's been weaving again, I heard." "I might," Hobble said, finishing the last of his bread. "Though she'll insist I trade half my honey for it." The two sat in companionable silence, listening to the soft chatter of the brook. After a time, Hobble noticed clouds gathering beyond the treetops, faint at first, but deepening. A cool wind rippled through the reeds, carrying the scent of rain. "Looks like a shower coming," he said. Finch nodded. "I'd best stay close to the water, then. Farewell, Hobble." "Good day to you, Finch." With that, Hobble packed up his basket and started home, the first drops already pattering on the leaves above. The rain came gently, not in a rush, but in a steady, silvery drizzle that softened the edges of everything. The path glistened, ferns bowed low, a rabbit darted into its burrow. By the time Hobble reached his door, his coat was speckled with droplets and his spines damp, but he didn't mind. The sound of rain against the window was one of his favorite things. He lit his small lamp, set a kettle on the stove, and laid out a clean cloth to dry his paws. Outside, the woods darkened into evening, the rain whispering through the trees. Inside, Hobble poured himself a cup of tea, rich with chamomile and mint, and spread another slice of bread with honey. He ate slowly, listening to the forest settle, a quiet rustle here, a far-off hoot there. When the kettle's hum faded and the lamplight flickered low, he curled up in his armchair by the window, watching raindrops trace tiny silver paths down the glass. The brook murmured softly beyond, and the trees stood in patient, contented silence. And there, with his belly warm and the smell of rain in the air, Hobble drifted into the most peaceful sort of sleep a creature could wish for, the kind where dreams come not as stories but as feelings, of moss beneath one's feet, honey on one's tongue, and the whole wide forest breathing gently all around. The morning after the rain smelled fresh and green, as if the whole forest had been gently washed and polished overnight. Tiny drops clung to every blade of grass, trembling like pearls whenever a breeze passed. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that promised a fine day once the sun rose high enough to warm the bark of the trees. Hobble woke early, blinking against the pale sunlight that slipped through his round window. The steady burble of Willowmere Brook reached him through the open door, mingled with the calls of finches and the faint crackle of drying leaves. He stretched, rubbed his eyes, and shuffled to the kitchen. Breakfast, of course, came first. He filled a small pot with oats, poured in water, and stirred it over the stove until it thickened just so, not too runny, not too stiff. Then came a generous spoon of Brand's honey, a few blackberries he'd gathered before the rain, and a pinch of cinnamon he'd been saving for a fine morning such as this. As the smell of warm honey and spice filled the burrow, Hobble hummed softly. "Can't imagine a better way to start the day," he said to himself. After eating, he stepped outside, closing the little round door behind him. The moss that carpeted his doorstep sparkled with dew, and the path that led through the undergrowth looked newly made, the footprints of yesterday washed clean. He decided to walk toward the old hollow oak, a great tree that stood near the far side of the forest. It was said to be older than anyone could remember, and many of the woodland creatures used its hollow trunk to store bits and bobs they didn't wish to carry home. The place was a kind of quiet meeting point, one where conversation was easy and no one was ever in a rush. Hobble followed the brook for a time, then turned where the path climbed gently between the roots of an elm. Here the forest grew denser, and the ground underfoot was soft and springy. Mushrooms sprouted in rings beside the path, smooth-capped and plump, smelling faintly of rain. A wren hopped between them, tilting its head curiously at Hobble before fluttering away. As he walked, he noticed a fallen twig lying right across the path. Normally, that wouldn't have caught his attention, but this one was oddly placed, as if someone had dragged it there on purpose. It was smooth and pale, stripped of bark, and pointed at one end. Hobble bent to examine it, frowning a little. "Now who's been leaving their tools about?" he murmured. "Someone might trip." He reached down, intending to move it aside, when a voice called out from the nearby ferns. "Mind where you're stepping, Hobble." "That's mine." Out popped Rill the Vole, paws muddy, whiskers twitching with indignation. "That's my measuring stick. I've been using it to mark out a new burrow." "Ah, my apologies," said Hobble, straightening. "Didn't realize it was official equipment." "Quite all right," Rill said, brushing off his fur. "You're up early." "Off somewhere." "To the old hollow oak," Hobble replied. "Thought I might see if any of the others are about, and perhaps gather a few chestnuts along the way." "Chestnuts, eh? You'll find plenty near the slope beyond the oak," Rill said helpfully. I saw the shells falling yesterday before the rain came. Mind you, the ground will still be slippery. I'll tread carefully, Hobble promised. Good luck with your digging. Rill waved his tiny paw in farewell and disappeared once again among the ferns. The path grew steeper, winding between trunks so wide that Hobble could have hidden entirely behind one. The air was filled with the sweet, woody scent of mushrooms and damp moss. Sunlight poured through in golden shafts, lighting up dust motes like drifting specks of amber. After a while, the forest opened into a small clearing, and there it stood, the old hollow oak. It was enormous, its bark gnarled and furrowed like an old face, its roots spreading out in tangled ridges that looked almost like frozen waves. The hollow at its base was large enough for 3 hedgehogs to stand inside, and the air within carried the scent of dry leaves and acorns. Near the hollow, perched on a mossy log, sat Penny the dormouse, nibbling a seed. She looked up as Hobble approached and smiled sleepily. "Morning, Hobble. Lovely day for wandering." "Morning, Penny," he said, tipping his cap. "And indeed it is. I thought I might stop for a rest." "You've come at the right time," she said, gesturing toward a small bundle beside her. "I packed a few things for tea." From the bundle, she produced a small flask of blackberry cordial, 2 slices of nut bread wrapped in a leaf, and a neat wedge of soft white cheese. "Would you share a bit?" she asked. "Gladly," Hobble said, sitting beside her. They ate together, quietly, listening to the forest murmur around them. The nut bread was firm and slightly sweet, with just enough crunch to be satisfying, and the cheese melted perfectly on the tongue. Penny poured him a little cordial, dark and tart, with the faintest sweetness of honey. "Delicious," Hobble said appreciatively. "You've a real talent for mixing flavors." Penny blushed modestly. "Oh, it's nothing. I just add a few mint leaves to the cordial before bottling. Keeps it fresh." They sat a while longer, chatting about this and that. The way the riverbank had shifted after the rain, how Bran's marigolds had begun to bloom a second time, how Tib the mouse had started collecting bits of ribbon she found near the footpath. Just as Hobble was thinking of standing up again, a rustle sounded from above, then another, heavier one. A shower of leaves fluttered down, followed by a sharp thump, as something small landed beside them. Out tumbled Brindle the squirrel, blinking in surprise. "Oh," she said, brushing herself off. "Didn't see you there. Lost my balance trying to reach that last hazelnut. Are you all right?" Penny asked, half laughing. "Perfectly fine," Brindle said with dignity, though her tail was a bit dusty. "The nut, however, is gone. Rolled right down the hill, I expect." "I'll help you look," said Hobble, getting to his feet. The 3 of them followed the slope beyond the oak, where the ground was covered in a thick blanket of fallen leaves. They rustled softly underfoot as they searched. "There!" Brindle cried suddenly, pointing. The hazelnut had come to rest beside a patch of bright green moss, half hidden among chestnut shells. Hobble bent to retrieve it, and as he did, he spotted several chestnuts lying nearby, glossy and brown, still snug in their spiky husks. "Well now," he said, smiling, "I think I've found what I came for." The 3 of them spent the next while gathering chestnuts and chatting as they worked. Brindle climbed easily up the lower branches to shake loose a few more, while Hobble and Penny collected what fell. The sun climbed higher, and the clearing filled with warm golden light. By the time they'd finished, Hobble's basket was nearly full. He offered some of the haul to his companions, but both refused. "Keep them," Penny said. "You'll make something wonderful with them, I'm sure." "Perhaps," Hobble mused. "Chestnut loaf, maybe, or a stew with mushrooms in time." "Oh, that sounds lovely," Brindle sighed. "You must tell me when it's ready." "I will," said Hobble. They parted soon after, Penny wandering back toward her nest in the elder thicket, and Brindle scampering off through the branches toward her high tree home. Hobble began the walk back to his burrow, humming softly to himself. The forest in early afternoon was a world of gentle motion, bees weaving between late wildflowers, the brook whispering softly, the occasional crack of a twig as some small creature darted away unseen. The smell of damp leaves was rich and comforting. When Hobble reached his home once more, he set the basket of chestnuts on the counter, rolled up his sleeves, and began to prepare supper. He scored the shells with a small knife, placed them in a pan, and roasted them gently over the stove. Soon the burrow filled with their sweet, nutty scent. He mashed a few into a paste, stirred them into a bit of cream, and poured the mixture over a bowl of stewed mushrooms and herbs. It was a humble meal, but as he sat by the window, spoon in hand, the rain-washed world outside glowing faintly with sunset, it felt exactly right. A soft knock came at the door. Hobble looked up. "Come in," he called. The door creaked open, and in stepped Rill the Vole, looking slightly flustered and carrying a small earthen jar. "Evening, Hobble. Sorry to intrude, but I thought I'd bring you some of my pickled roots. You helped with that troublesome oak root this morning, and I never properly thanked you." Hobble smiled warmly. "That's very kind of you, Rill. Come in. I've chestnut stew, if you'd like a bowl." Rill's whiskers twitched. "Don't mind if I do." They ate together in companionable silence for a time, listening to the soft sounds of the forest settling outside, the sigh of wind through the reeds, the gentle croak of a distant frog. When their bowls were empty, Hobble brought out 2 cups of mint tea, the steam curling gently upward. "To a good day's work," he said. "To fine company," Rill replied, clinking his cup against Hobble's. And so the two sat long into the evening, talking quietly, the lamplight painting warm circles on the wooden walls. Outside, the night deepened, calm and clear, the brook singing softly in the dark. When at last Rill took his leave, Hobble stood at the doorway a while, watching the stars appear between the branches. The forest seemed to breathe in the cool night air, alive yet utterly still. He smiled, feeling the quiet satisfaction that comes from a day well spent, not in adventure or excitement, but in the small, gentle rhythm of living. Then he closed the door, banked the stove, and settled into his chair. The lamp flickered low, the scent of chestnuts lingered in the air, and Hobble the Hedgehog drifted into dreams of moss and moonlight. The days had grown shorter, and the forest was beginning to wear its autumn colors. The beeches had turned to soft amber, the maples burned red in the afternoon light, and the moss beneath Hobble's paws felt cooler now when he stepped out in the morning. The brook, though still chattering merrily, carried a sharper tone in its music, the sound of colder water running over smooth stones. Hobble was up early again. He liked this time of year, when the air was clear and the light seemed softer. His burrow was cozy with its small stove burning and a little clay pot of tea steaming on the table. The scent of dried mint filled the air. He had decided that today would be a day of tidying and fixing, the sort of quiet work that made one feel usefully busy. He planned to patch the small leak in his kettle, brush the dust from his shelves, and oil the latch on his door, which had begun to squeak when the evening damp set in. As he sorted through his cupboards, he found an old teapot, a lovely round one, glazed a pale green and painted with faded blue leaves. The lid, however, was missing. Hobble frowned, trying to recall when he had last seen it. Then it came to him. He had lent the lid to Mrs. Trindle, the mole from down by the meadow path, some weeks ago when hers had cracked clean in half. He chuckled softly. "Well, now, can't have a teapot without its hat," he said. "Best go see if she's done with it." He packed a small loaf of nut bread and a jar of honey. Gifts were polite, after all, and stepped outside. The forest was calm, touched with a low mist that hung over the ground like a blanket. Dew sparkled on cobwebs strung between the brambles, and the first hints of frost glimmered on the shaded leaves. Hobble followed the narrow path along the brook, his paws leaving small prints in the soft earth. As he walked, he noticed the way the light caught on the water. Silver one moment, gold the next, and the soft thud of acorns falling somewhere off in the trees. After a short walk, he reached the meadow edge where the trees opened up into rolling grass, still wet with morning dew. Mrs. Trindle's burrow was there, beneath a gentle rise of earth dotted with wild violets and small stones arranged neatly around the entrance. A faint smell of freshly baked bread drifted out. "Mrs. Trindle?" Hobble called softly. From within came a muffled voice. "Just a moment, dear." A minute later, Mrs. Trindle emerged, her fur a little dusty from work, her spectacles perched at the end of her nose. "Well, Hobble, what a nice surprise. I was just baking. You'll have a slice, won't you?" "I wouldn't say no," Hobble admitted, smiling. "But I've come to see about my teapot lid. Only if you're finished with it, of course." Mrs. Trindle blinked, then clapped her paws together. "Oh, heavens! I'd quite forgotten. It's been sitting by the window for days, waiting for you. Wait here." She disappeared inside and returned a moment later with the lid, carefully wrapped in a scrap of cloth. "There we are. Good as new, and I gave a little polish for you." "Much obliged," Hobble said warmly, taking it. "And I've brought you something in return." He handed her the jar of honey and the small loaf. "Oh, Hobble," she said, touched. "You didn't have to." "It's nothing," he replied. "Honey's meant to be shared." "Well, if you insist," she said with a twinkle. "Then you'll stay for tea." Hobble hadn't planned to linger, but the smell of baking was too inviting to refuse. They sat at her small round table with steaming cups of tea and slices of warm seed bread spread with a bit of plum jam. The bread was dense but soft, with sunflower and flax seeds that gave it a pleasant crunch. The jam, dark and rich, had a faint taste of clove. Mrs. Trindle talked as she poured. "You know, Bran was here just yesterday," she said. "Brought me a pot of marigold salve for my paws. Says the bees are beginning to slow down for the season." "I'm not surprised," Hobble said. "They've worked hard this year. He told me he might close a few hives before the frost comes." "Makes sense," Mrs. Trindle said, sipping her tea. "And how's that old stove of yours? Still puffing like a train, I expect." "It is," Hobble said with a grin. "But it keeps the burrow warm." When their cups were empty and the bread all but gone, Hobble stood. "I best head back. The day's getting on, and I've a kettle to mend before the rain starts again." Mrs. Trindle walked him to the door. "Do take a bit of bread for later," she said, wrapping a few slices neatly in a leaf. "Thank you kindly," Hobble said. "You're too good to me." He made his way back through the forest, the teapot lid safe in his basket and the wrapped bread tucked beside it. The mist had lifted now, and the air was full of the soft hum of midday. The sun caught on spider threads between branches, making them glint like strands of silver hair. When Hobble reached the brook again, he paused at a small stone bench someone long ago had placed by the water's edge. He sat down, unpacked a slice of Mrs. Trindle's bread, and ate it slowly, watching the current twist and curl around smooth stones. Across the brook, he saw Tib, the field mouse, standing on tiptoe to peer into the water. "What are you up to there, Tib?" Hobble called. "Oh, hello, Hobble," said Tib, looking up. "I dropped my spoon. I was washing it after lunch, and it slipped away." "Ah, bad luck," said Hobble. "Shall I fetch it for you?" Tib brightened. "Would you? It's drifted down somewhere near that old alder root." Hobble crossed the narrow plank bridge and knelt by the root. Sure enough, something shiny glinted beneath the water. He rolled up his sleeves, reached in, and pulled out the small wooden spoon, now a little waterlogged, but none the worse for it. "There you are," he said, handing it over. Tib took it gratefully. "Oh, thank you. I don't know what I'd do without this spoon. It's the perfect size for porridge." "I quite understand," Hobble said solemnly. "A creature must be properly equipped for porridge." They both laughed, and Tib invited him to share a little snack, slices of pear and a few hazelnuts laid out on a flat stone. The pear was sweet and cool, its scent mingling with the earthy smell of the brook. "Fine fruit this year," Hobble remarked. "Indeed," said Tib. "The trees by the meadow have done well. You should take a few before the wind brings them down." "I might do just that," Hobble said thoughtfully. "They'd go nicely with my chestnut loaf." After they'd eaten, Hobble wished Tib good day and continued home. The air had grown cooler, and thin clouds stretched across the sky like pale threads. By the time he reached his burrow, the shadows were long and the forest had taken on that hushed stillness that comes before dusk. Inside, he set the teapot lid gently on the table and smiled at how neatly it fit, as though it had never been missing. Then he lit his stove, mended his kettle, and warmed a small pot of stew left from the night before: chestnuts, mushrooms, and a hint of thyme. He poured himself a cup of tea, rich and fragrant, and sat by the window as twilight settled outside. The brook whispered softly, the first stars began to show, and a faint curl of smoke from Bran's chimney rose through the trees in the distance. Hobble took a sip of tea and sighed contentedly. The kettle no longer leaked, the teapot had its lid, and the world felt settled again. In that quiet, ordinary way that only the woods of Willowmere could provide. He stayed by the window long after his cup was empty, watching the stars multiply, listening to the soft chorus of crickets and the gentle sigh of the forest breathing into night. And when he finally went to bed, with the cool air drifting through his open window and the steady sound of the brook beyond, Hobble felt that life was, for the moment, just as it should be: simple, calm, and good. The first truly cold wind of the season came 2 mornings later, arriving quietly before dawn. It slipped down the slopes and between the trunks like a whisper, lifting the dry leaves into small eddies that rattled along the forest floor. When the sun rose, pale and weak, it touched the world in silvers and browns. The deep greens of summer were gone, and the forest had taken on that crisp, thoughtful mood that meant autumn was settling in for good. Hobble woke to find the air sharp inside his burrow, even though he'd closed the shutters tight. He pulled his little blanket up around his shoulders and peered toward the stove. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, leaving only a faint scent of wood smoke and ash. "Well," he muttered, rubbing his paws together, "time to fetch more wood before breakfast." Outside, the world looked freshly rearranged. The brook ran low now, its banks thick with fallen leaves. The ferns had wilted back into bronze curls, and the moss on his doorstep glistened with frost. Hobble could see his breath puffing out in soft clouds as he walked toward his small woodpile beneath the oak roots. He worked slowly, stacking the logs by the door, listening to the forest waking. The distant caw of crows, the chatter of squirrels shaking dew from branches, the muffled tapping of a woodpecker somewhere down the slope. When he returned inside, the room began to warm again as the fire caught and glowed. Breakfast was simple that morning. Toasted seed bread with honey and a slice of soft pear that he'd tucked away after his visit to Tib. He sat by the round window, watching the light shift from cold blue to pale gold. It was then that he noticed the apple tree across the brook, its branches trembling in the wind. A dozen ripe apples still clung stubbornly to the higher boughs, though many had already fallen, rolling into the grass below. Hobble tilted his head thoughtfully. "Those won't last long," he murmured. "Best gather what's left before the frost spoils them." He packed a basket, pulled on his scarf, a thick, woolly thing Penny had made last winter, and set out toward the tree. The air was brisk, the kind that nips gently at your nose, and carried the faint scent of wet leaves and wood smoke. When he reached the apple tree, he found Brindle the squirrel there already, busily sorting apples into 2 neat piles. She looked up as he approached, her tail flicking with energy. "Morning, Hobble. I thought I'd beat the wind, but it seems it beat me." "Morning, Brindle," Hobble said with a smile. "You've got quite a collection there." Some good ones, some bruised," she said, inspecting an apple critically. "The best ones I'll dry for winter." What about you? I thought I might make a bit of compote, Hobble said. Something to spoon over porridge. Sounds splendid. I'll trade you a few of mine for a jar when it's ready. Done, Hobble said. They spent the next hour gathering what remained, working side by side in companionable silence. The wind kept tugging at the branches, shaking loose the last leaves, which fluttered down around them like scraps of gold paper. Every so often Brindle would scurry up to reach one that had gotten stuck in the crook of a limb, tossing it down into Hobble's waiting paws. By the time they were done, the basket was heavy and the sun was slanting through the branches at a sleepy angle. Care for a cup of tea before you go? Hobble asked. Brindle's eyes brightened. If there's honey in it. There's always honey, Hobble said. They carried the basket back across the brook, the wind at their backs, whispering softly through the tall grasses. Inside Hobble's burrow, the air was warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke. Hobble set the kettle on while Brindle arranged the apples near the window to catch the light. Steam began to fill the room, and soon the soft clink of mugs joined the sound of the fire crackling. Hobble poured the tea, golden and fragrant, and set out a small dish of dried chestnuts from the week before. Brindle took a sip, sighed contentedly, and let her tail curl around her paws. You know, she said, this is the best part of the season. Cold outside, warm inside, and everything smells like leaves and bread. Hobble nodded. I agree. There's something steady about it. The forest gets quieter, but it feels content. They sat a while longer, not saying much, letting the silence hum softly between them. The window glowed with a dim amber light as the sun sank lower. When Brindle finally left, the air outside had turned still again, and the sky was streaked with pale clouds. Hobble saw her disappear among the trees, her tail flickering like a spark in the fading light. He cleaned up the mugs and began peeling apples by the stove. The rhythmic scrape of the knife and the gentle bubbling of the pot soon filled the little burrow. He added a spoon of honey and a pinch of cinnamon, stirring slowly until the scent filled the air, sweet, warm, and comforting. As the compote cooled, Hobble placed it in 2 small jars, one for himself and one for Brindle as promised. Outside, dusk deepened. A thin mist began to gather again along the brook, curling around the roots and stones. Hobble decided to step out for a short walk before bed, just to stretch his legs. The forest at twilight had a different sort of quiet. The wind had dropped to a whisper, and every sound carried farther. The soft trickle of water, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the faint rustle of some small creature finding its burrow for the night. The air smelled of damp bark and distant smoke. Hobble followed the familiar path past the old bridge and toward the clearing where the hollow oak stood. The sky above the branches was a deep blue, with the first few stars trembling faintly. When he reached the oak, he saw something unusual, a faint glow inside the hollow. Curious, he stepped closer. It was a small lantern, its flames steady and golden. Someone had left it there, perhaps by accident. Beside it sat a small cloth bag, tied neatly with twine. Hobble hesitated, then knelt to look inside. The bag contained several walnuts, a few chestnuts, and a folded note that read, "For whoever needs them most, from a friend." He smiled softly. The woods had their little mysteries. Not grand ones, but kind, quiet gestures like this that made life here what it was. Well, he said, tucking the note back, that's a lovely thought. He decided to leave it untouched, setting the lantern upright again so its light fell warmly across the roots of the old tree. Then he stood for a while, hands in his coat pockets, listening to the stillness. The forest around him breathed gently, the leaves whispering high above, the brook murmuring far off. Somewhere, an owl hooted once, low and slow. When Hobble finally turned to go, the lantern's light flickered against the trees, casting soft gold patterns that swayed with the wind. He followed the path home, the air cold but clean in his lungs. Back in his burrow, he hung up his scarf, poured himself a little more tea, and sat by the window once again. The stars were clear now, bright and close, and the world beyond was silvered with moonlight. He thought of the lantern in the oak, of the note's simple kindness, and of how every small act, a shared loaf, a returned teapot lid, an apple gathered from the wind, wove the forest together in quiet threads of friendship. The kettle purred softly, and Hobble smiled. Tomorrow he'd tell Bran about the lantern. Maybe they'd find out whose it was, or maybe they wouldn't. It hardly mattered. Some things were meant to stay small and lovely and unexplained. He finished his tea, let the fire burn low, and curled up beneath his blanket. The brook outside whispered its lullaby, and the wind returned at last, gentle now, brushing past the window as if to say goodnight. And so, in the heart of the sleeping forest, beneath stars and frost and the scent of apples still lingering in the air, Hobble drifted into dreams, soft and simple and full of light. Snow came late that year. For weeks, the sky had been pale and heavy, as though holding its breath. But when the first flakes finally began to fall, they did so gently. Not a storm, not a bluster, just a quiet, steady descent that softened the whole forest into stillness. Hobble woke to it one morning in early December. He opened his shutters and found the world outside transformed. The brook ran black between white banks. The ferns bowed under delicate caps of snow, and the great beech tree above his burrow wore a crown of frost. Even the air seemed slower, muffled. He dressed warmly, a thick jumper, his brown coat, and the wool scarf Penny had made, and stepped out to sweep his doorstep. The broom made a soft swish-swish sound against the snow, the only noise in that white hush. His breath rose in small clouds, curling away into the cold. Inside, the burrow smelled of wood smoke and apple compote. The fire had burned low overnight, but the room was still warm. On the table sat a little pot of honey and a heel of crusty bread left from yesterday. Hobble cut a slice, spread the honey thickly, and sat down by the round window. He liked to eat breakfast watching the snow drift past, each flake twisting in its own slow dance. By midday, the snow had deepened, and the forest glowed faintly with it. Hobble pulled on his boots and decided to visit Penny the rabbit, who lived up the slope beyond the hazel grove. He packed a jar of apple compote in his basket, a small gift, and started up the path. The forest in snow was a different world. Every twig carried a white edge. The sound of his steps was muted and close. Here and there, he saw the tracks of others, small prints, narrow trails, the delicate pattern of a bird's wings where it had lifted from the ground. When he reached Penny's burrow, he found her outside, wearing a red shawl and dusting snow from the entrance. Her long ears twitched when she saw him. "Hobble, what a lovely surprise. You're not lost, are you?" "Not yet," he said, smiling. "I brought you this." He handed her the jar, and she clapped her paws together in delight. "Apple. Oh, how splendid. You'll stay for lunch, won't you? If it's no trouble." "Never trouble," Penny said, ushering him inside. Her burrow was tidy and warm, the walls lined with dried herbs and bundles of lavender. The air smelled of thyme and soup. She had a small pot bubbling over the fire, and Hobble could see carrots and turnips bobbing inside. "Just a bit of vegetable stew," she said, ladling into bowls. "It's better with company." They ate at her small table, steam rising between them. The stew was rich and hearty, and Penny served it with slices of rye bread. For dessert, they shared Hobble's apple compote, spooned over a bit of cream she'd saved from her morning milk. "It's quiet, isn't it?" Penny said after a while. "It is," Hobble replied. "The sort of quiet that feels full, not empty." Penny nodded. "The forest sleeps, but it doesn't rest. Everything's just waiting." They sat together a while longer, listening to the faint crackle of the fire and the soft wind beyond the door. When Hobble finally stood to go, Penny packed him a small bundle, a bit of bread, a few dried herbs for the way home," she said. Outside, the snow was still falling thicker now. The trees bent under its weight, their branches glittering faintly in the pale light. Hobble walked slowly, watching his footprints fill in behind him, the forest closing softly over his path. Halfway home, he stopped by the old oak, the one with the lantern. The light was gone now, the hollow half filled with snow, but he brushed it clear gently and smiled. The memory of that little flame lingered in him, bright as ever. When he reached his burrow again, the windows glowed with warmth against the cold blue dusk. He hung up his scarf, shook the snow from his boots, and stirred the fire back to life. The flames leapt eagerly, painting the room in gold. Dinner was simple that evening. The rest of Penny's bread, toasted and buttered, with a bit of cheese and thyme tea. He ate slowly, savoring it, the way one does when everything outside is white and still. Later, he brought his blanket to the armchair by the fire and settled in. The light flickered across the walls, catching the shelves lined with jars and the little wooden figures he'd carved in quieter months. The brook outside murmured faintly beneath its crust of ice, like a voice talking in its sleep. Hobble thought about the year, about the spring mornings full of birdsong, the long green days of summer, the honey trade with Bran, the apple wind, the lantern, the first frost. So many small moments, strung together like beads, ordinary but lovely. He thought too of his friends. Tib with his chatter and crumbs, Brindle with her quick paws and clever eyes, Bran's steady laugh, Penny's gentle ways. The forest was large, but somehow every path led back to someone's door. As the fire sank lower, he poured himself one last cup of tea and stood at the window. The snow had stopped. The moon shone low over the trees, laying silver on the brook. Every branch and stone gleamed faintly. The world seemed to hold its breath. Hobble smiled, the kind of smile that starts small and stays a while. "Well," he murmured, "we've done all right, haven't we?" He turned down the lamp, climbed into bed, and pulled the blanket close. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the snow shifted once, then settled. The night was deep and kind, and in the heart of the forest, beneath frost, moonlight, and dreaming trees, everything rested. The brook, the burrows, the tiny hearts tucked safely in the earth. The lantern in the hollow might light again come spring, but for now, the forest was at peace. Hobble closed his eyes. The last thing he heard before sleep was the faint sigh of the wind through the beech leaves, whispering its quiet promise that winter would pass and the moss would green again. The end. Thank you for wandering through the woods with me. If you'd like to return for more quiet stories and soft moments, don't forget to follow the trail back. Like, subscribe, and I'll meet you again under the green canopy soon.